Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm doing the one album per decade challenge. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So there always seems to be a lot of these threads that go around the vinyl community on YouTube, and most of them I really don't pay all that much attention to. But every once in a while, one catches my eye. I thought this one was actually pretty ingenious. But this one comes from Spins Vinyl. I'll put a link down below if you want to go check out his YouTube page or his YouTube channel. But so basically, what this is you go back to through your record collection, and you pick out one album per decade. So if your record collection goes all the way back to the 40s, you would start in the 40s and pick one album that you could pick and listen to for the rest of your life, and that's your only one album for that decade. And there's some decades that are pretty diverse. You know, look at like the 90s, where you've got all this great rock music and alternative and grunge, and like the end of hair metal and great rap, great R&B, so many different genres, but you can only pick one album for that decade. So that's why I thought it was a pretty cool idea. So my record collection starts in the 50s, so that's where I'm going to start with my list. And with the 50s, there's a lot of great music there. You get some great jazz music, you get some great blues, you get the beginnings of rock music also. But I decided to stick with jazz because it's one of my favorite genres, and there's so much great jazz music from the 50s, especially like the late part of the 50s. So the first album is from 1958, and that is Blue Train by John Coltrane. Of course, Coltrane has long been my favorite jazz musician, and this was probably, I think Love Supreme was probably the first jazz album I ever listened to, but Blue Train was just after that. This is an album that I could definitely, if I picked one album from the 50s, this is one that I could listen to for the rest of my life and be completely happy with. So we're going to jump 10 years ahead with my pick for the 60s, and the 60s it probably wasn't as hard for me because rock really dominated the 60s, and maybe the Beatles. I loved a lot of the stuff from the Doors, but there's one album in particular that, like I said, if I had to pick one album from the 60s, this is one that I could be happy with, just listen to for the rest of my life. And that album is Beggar's Banquet by the Rolling Stones. And this is an album that I didn't come to. I wasn't the biggest Rolling Stones fan when I was growing up. It probably wasn't until probably my late 20s, early 30s when I really started getting into the Rolling Stones. And like this, Let It Bleed is another great album I could have went with also. But like that late 60s, early 70s period from the Stones is just unbelievable. The 70s was definitely a hard decade for me because, I mean, I love so many great albums from that decade. I mean, of course, Dark Side of the Moon is my favorite album of all time. So did I really want to pick that? Yeah, I don't really know. It's an album that I really love, but could I really just listen to that without listening to, say, like Led Zeppelin 4 or Rocket to Russia is another great album from the 70s. But I decided to pick the album for the 70s that is an album that I have listened to pretty much constantly for the last 30, 35 years. And that album is Billion Dollar Babies by Alice Cooper. The funny thing is, this is not my favorite Alice Cooper album. Killer is probably my favorite album from them, but the quality on Billion Dollar Babies, there's not a skippable track on here. It's something that I still listen to this. Like I said, I own this on cassette. I've owned this on CD. Of course, I have it on vinyl also. Like, it's an album that I've listened to pretty constantly for like I said, 30, 35 years. So for the 80s, we're going to jump ahead 16 years. That's the biggest gap between albums in my list. And it's an album that when I started thinking about 80s albums, this was the obvious choice for me. Even though, like, Appetite for Destruction was a huge album for me personally. When Appetite for Destruction came out, I was like 7 or 8 years old. It was really kind of forming my own musical interests. So it was really between that album and the album I decided to go to. But I mean, the album I picked is the album that, when this was released in '89, I mean, I remember the day it came out. And maybe not the day it came out, but I remember I picked it up probably shortly after the album was released. It's another one of those albums I've had on cassette, I've had it on CD. Of course, I got it on vinyl also. But the album is Disintegration by The Cure, and this is along the same lines as Alice Cooper. This is not my favorite album from The Cure. Wish is my favorite album. Disintegration is probably just behind that. Of course, everyone knows this album for Love Song. But there's so many other great tracks on this album that, me personally, I think is even better than that one track. So like I said earlier, I knew the 90s was going to be a difficult pick for me, just because there was such a great variety of music in that decade, whether it's like the Black Album from Metallica, or User Illusion 1 and 2, or the beginnings of grunge with like Nevermind and 10, or even like later in the decade, there was just so many great albums came out, even like with rap, with The Chronic earlier in the year, or the end of the decade with some of the great stuff that Eminem started doing at the beginning of his career. Just like I said, the 90s overall, I've long considered it probably the greatest diverse decade for music. And then the one pick, I'm sure people are probably going to hate this one, but the pick I decided to go with was released in 1994, and that is Dookie by Green Day. This is the album that, even though And Out Come the Wolves, for me, I think is the greatest punk album ever released. Dookie was the album that actually got me into punk, even though like Dookie didn't get me into other punk bands like And Out Come the Wolves did. When Rancid released that, that's when I got into like Operation Ivy and Bad Religion and some other stuff that came out earlier. But Dookie was the album that really kind of got me away from grunge music and got me looking in a different direction. And to be completely honest, I'm sure people are going to hate my last three picks also. But for my pick for the 2000s is an album. This was another easy pick for me. Ever since it was released, I've considered this probably one of the top 5 or 10 albums ever released. And that album is the Untitled album from Blink-182. This was released in 2003. And I know people of course know Blink from Enema of the State, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, Dude Ranch, their earlier albums where it was definitely more like straightforward kind of pop punk kind of stuff, kind of goofy, kind of funny, with some more serious themes. But this album went in a completely different direction. There's like emo stuff on here. There's some more like straightforward alternative stuff on here, but it's a darker album. It's a gloomier album. They do a track with Robert Smith from The Cure on here, which is I think one of the best tracks that Blink ever released. And I think it really kind of showed the diversity in their musical style and what the band really could do. And then the 2010s hit. And to be completely honest, I feel like music really got kind of boring and dull in the 2010s. Really, I think, most of the innovation in music in that decade was really coming out of rap. And there's a bunch of really great rap music that was released in that decade. And the one I think is the best and one that I can listen to all the time, it's a great album. It's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West. I know a lot of people hate Kanye, and he says a bunch of dumb things, and he says a bunch of racist things and anti-Semitic things, but musically, I think he's a genius. And this is, I think, the kind of the pinnacle, I think, of his career. I know Graduation was another great album. I love Donda, but what he did on this album, I think, was just pure genius. And then for the 2020s, I think music overall over the last 3 years has been unbelievable. So many great albums from a wide spectrum of artists have come out. Some of my favorite punk music has come out in the 2020s. Some of my favorite rock music has come out in the last 3 years. I'm talking of the 2000s. And I think the quality of music in the 2020s, I think, has returned to where it really was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I probably had at least 24 albums I could have picked from. I decided to go with a really recent pick that I love this album. It's probably one of my top 5 or 10 albums of the 2000s. I know a lot of people out there probably are going to agree with that one, but it's the new album from Post Malone, Austin. This is an album I've loved. It just came out within the last couple of weeks. I probably listened to this album at least 2 or 3 dozen times since it came out. It's been on pretty regular repeat, and this is an album that, like I said, going over this whole list, that's what all these picks were albums that might not necessarily be my favorite albums, but albums that I had to pick one album for a decade. It was an album that I could listen to for the rest of my life, and this is definitely one of them. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Some great albums. I had, 8 picks on here. Drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of these. And also, I'd love to know what you guys think from your collection. If you've got a YouTube channel, make sure you do a video to kind of continue this thread. It's really fun. I really like this idea. I want to say thanks to Spins Vinyl for starting it. I'll drop that comment. I'll drop that link down below. Make sure you go check their channel out. But if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.